Ecclesiastes, beginning at chapter 11 and verse 7. We've called it Life Under the Sun. You can see the picture of the sun, and we live on this earth, and Ecclesiastes is writing about life as it is on earth without, much of the time, any idea of God at all. If it is indeed Solomon writing this, he is someone who abandoned God, it seems, in certainly part of his life, maybe even large chunks of his life. And he is now explaining to us what it means if you live your life without God, what it is like. And it's been hard going in terms of what we've been reading and the sense we have of life being very difficult, very painful on many occasions. This man himself, Ecclesiastes, is searching for meaning. And we read there, how at the end he said, it's meaningless. I can't find meaning. I can't make sense of this life on its own terms, as it is, as we live it, without God in the picture. If I asked you to tell me what your idea of the tone of this book is, I wonder what you would say to me, the whole book. What would be the tone, what would be the mood of the whole book? I would call it sorrowful. I'd call it wistful. I'd call it realistic. And maybe other things as well, maybe other words that you have to describe the sense, the mood of this man as he writes about his experiences. But now we've come to chapter 11 and last week to verse 1, and actually the mood changes. What's been sorrowful, wistful and realistic up to now suddenly becomes much more vigorous and resolute. And so look at the verb in chapter 11 verse 1, cast, and then verse 2, give, and then verse 6, sow your seed and don't be idle. Suddenly now, rather than sort of meandering around and thinking about life as it is, he's giving instructions, he's giving commands, and saying, now you've heard what the Lord is saying, now do this. And the word now, remember, is this big command from this morning. And the word remember is going to occur 3 times, chapter 11 and verse 8. Let him, or indeed her, remember the days of darkness. Chapter 12 and verse 1. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth. And then again in verse 6. Remember him before the silver cord is severed. There'll be powerful words, powerful commands from Ecclesiastes. And when it says remember, he's not talking about what you remember in school. I expect in school, if you go to school, I don't know, maybe you're home taught, I don't know, but I expect you're learning things and you're told to remember things, aren't you? You're told to remember your times table, aren't you? Yeah? Have you looked at your times table yet? Remember this, that 8 7s are 56, okay? And 9 8s are, yeah, that is remembering, but it's not the remembering that the writer is talking about here. Maybe it's history. You maybe remember the date that William the Conqueror came, which was 1066, and all that. There's a book written about that, isn't there? All the facts you can remember from British history. That was my skill. That was what I did as a teacher. I used to teach facts of history. Well, not just facts, but facts among them certainly. But here, the remember he's talking about is about when you remember, say, for instance, you think, remember your mother. Remember, if you're an adult, your children. Remember your grandchildren. Have you forgotten them? Of course you haven't. But I'm saying, call to mind, what are you thinking about when you think about your children and your grandchildren? Or maybe a friend, a very dear friend. Or a romantic partner. You don't just remember them. You know they are alive, don't you? Or maybe they're not alive, I don't know. But you can remember them very easily. You know that they haven't been forgotten. But when I say remember them, your mind stirs up there a lot of images and thoughts and maybe affections as well. Do you know, in Exodus, when Israel was in slavery in Egypt, it says God remembered them. And we hadn't forgotten they were in Egypt, in slavery. But it says that they were groaning and under slavery. They were in great pain and very oppressed. And God heard, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he had compassion on them. Now, when you think of those people I asked you to think about a little while ago, your mother, your child, your grandchildren, your friend, whoever it may be, did you remember them and you had affections? You had maybe compassion for them, or you had love for them, whatever it may be? That's a sort of remembering that we're being asked to do here. Remember your Creator. Don't just forget, oh yes, there is a God after all, I know that. That isn't what the writer is asking you to do. He's asking you to call up what you feel about him, what you understand about him, what your affections are towards him. And here, therefore, with all his wisdom, maybe Ecclesiastes is an old man. If it is Solomon, he's probably an older man who's been through many trials and difficulties in his life. And he's saying now, with all my wisdom that I've learned from being under the sun and deserting God, with all my experience of life, I want to appeal to you, particularly if you're young. I want to appeal to your mind and your emotions and your imagination. And I want to stir your heart this morning to remember your Creator while you are young. So what does he say here? Well, first of all, he says, yes, I want you to enjoy life to the full. I said it earlier in Ecclesiastes, we've been exhorted to enjoy the common things of life, food and drink, and work and marriage. And now, the writer extends that to the whole of life, but with special reference to youth, to the period when we are young. Often, for us, when life is at its sweetest, and the world appears to be at our feet. But two warnings we are given here. The first, remember, is there in verse 8. Remember, he says, don't close your eyes to what? How many years a person may live, let him enjoy them all, but let him remember the days of darkness, for they will be many. He's looking ahead and he's saying, look, you're enjoying being young, but don't forget the eternal perspective. Eternity is on the horizon. It may be a long way off at the moment, and you may not even think about it, but it is going to come to you. And every day you live, that horizon will get closer and closer. Don't forget about it. Youth, when you're young, it's a passing phase. You'll enter it, you'll enjoy it, and you'll pass through it, and suddenly you'll realise you're in a different phase. My daughter's just had a baby, her first baby over in Canada. Only a little while ago she was at school. And now it seems, well, it's 14 years, but now she's moved up in a new generation. I have as well. But you realise that the days when she was young, when she was a child in our home, they're actually long past now. And she is now a mother in her own right. It moves on very quickly, and it doesn't return. Every day you live, you won't live again. You move on to the next day, and the next week, and the next month, and the next year. And on the horizon, we see there is darkness. It's not very nice, is it? Darkness is on the horizon. That might refer to death. And it could, I think it's the most likely interpretation, that actually he's seeing that there is this great big uncertainty, this great big void, which he calls darkness. He doesn't know what's there. He has no light for what happens after death. It could refer to calamity, but disasters that may happen in your life. But I think death is more likely. And then he says everything to come is meaningless. Now that word meaningless translates what is in the past has been called vanity, and in the original Hebrew is a word that means empty or vapour. It's something that just isn't real, doesn't last. So meaningless is perhaps a translation of that word, but it's not necessarily the best or the only translation. I think here, by meaningless, he's referring to what we read about it in the first 3 verses, the uncertainty of life. Do you remember there, he said, about clouds being full of water, and the tree falling to the south or the north, and we don't know what's going to happen. So he says in verse 5, you do not know the path of the winds, or how the body is formed in a mother's womb. We can't understand the work of God, the maker of all things. It's that sense of the future being uncertain that I think that he is referring to here. It's unpredictable. As we heard in an earlier sermon, it's open to time and chance. That's what it means to be meaningless. We can't figure it out. We can't be sure what's going to happen at all. And therefore we need to remember that is coming, and take note of that when we pray, when we think about our Creator. Remember the perspective, the eternal perspective. The second thing we're asked to remember here, I think, is what does it say there? Can't read my own writing there. The moral dimension. The moral dimension. So look at verse 9. Be happy, young man, while you are young, and let your heart give you joy in the days of your youth. Follow the ways of your heart, and whatever your eyes see. But know that for all these things, God will bring you to judgment. That God does act as a judge, and everything we do is going to be recorded in his books. We need to enjoy life and not live in fear, as we saw last week. But we need to enjoy life responsibly. I sometimes see adverts on the TV, often about things like drinking alcohol and betting. It says, but do bet responsibly, or do drink responsibly. We're not going to do those sort of things necessarily, but we actually need to live life and enjoy life, but to do so responsibly, taking note of the fact that how we live our lives is something that God will record. And he will judge us for the way we have lived our lives. He's given us life, and one day he will require an accounting of our lives from us. We're not completely free to live our lives however we like. Some young people think, I've got the freedom now to go and, the phrase is sow my wild oats, to live how I like, to live without any constraints. And the writer is not saying that here at all. Yes, enjoy life and go out and enjoy being young. But remember that God will ask for an accounting of what you've done with your time. And verse 10 concludes here with an exhortation, an encouragement to live our lives, yes, free of anxiety and stress. We saw it earlier, didn't we, last week, in fact, in the first 6 verses, that actually we can get very stressed and very tense and very worried, burdened by this life and all the things that may or may not happen. But he says here in verse 10, live your life free of anxiety, as indeed he said in verse 4. And it's a reminder also there, isn't it, that youth and vigour, these things that we have when we're young, are passing. Don't idolise them. Don't make idols of young people, or young people don't make idols of youth. It is going to pass. So enjoy life to the full with those 2 warnings. And then he goes on to chapter 12 and verse 1. And these are the words that I mentioned earlier that really struck me, that came home to me like a hammer in my late teens, I think it was. Remember your Creator, the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come, and the years approach when you will say, I find no pleasure in them. Remember your Creator, in other words, before old age creeps up on you. Before old age creeps up on you. I suspect here that if it is Solomon, he's reflecting on his own youth, looking back from many years afterwards, as he is perhaps an old man. And he's warning us. He says, don't think the time to turn to God is when you are old. A lot of people think that. They say, well, I'll live my life and enjoy it. When I get older and I get nearer the grave, then I'll start thinking about God. You remember I said here before about that French philosopher who once said, well, when I get to that point, God will forgive me. That's his job. God will forgive me, that's his job. And that takes God for granted, doesn't it? And it assumes that we can come to God whenever we like. But that isn't the case. God opens windows for us, windows of faith when we can respond to him. When he speaks to us, maybe this week on camp, God will speak to you through the word. And he'll call you. And you need to respond when that call comes. I'm not saying, no, I'm going to put you off God until I'm ready. I happen over my time at this church, many old people, not here necessarily in the church, but certainly going door to door. And that is the way they think. They can put God off until their old age. But I meet other old people who are old and who don't believe in God and struggle. I remember meeting one person once who had suddenly been diagnosed with terminal cancer. He was fit and healthy at Christmas. He wasn't a believer. And I was asked to go and meet him. And he had about 6 weeks to live. And he said, I need to know how I can get to heaven. And by this stage, he was being given drugs to help him with his pain and his cancer. And over those weeks, I did visit him from time to time, but never did I get any sense that he knew he'd become a Christian. Because actually, it's God who has to open the door of faith to us. Maybe God had invited him before, and he said no. And now he wants to, desperately before he dies. And he couldn't. I would talk with him, I'd explain the gospel to him, I'd pray with him. But each time I went back there, he would say, no, I don't understand it. Or I can't, what must I do? He kept saying, what must I do? I've got to do something. And of course, that isn't what you do at all, is it? To become a Christian, you have to receive faith as a gift. So the writer here says, don't leave it to your old age, because in your old age, you may not be able to respond to God. Don't go along with the idea that there are deathbed conversions all the time. There may well be from time to time. But please never rely on that, and never encourage anyone to rely on that. And if they say they are relying on it, discourage them. Because the Bible teaches the exact opposite of that. Remember your Creator before those days come. If you're a young person here this morning, I wonder what you think about being old. You know, when I was 24, I reversed those digits and thought, I wonder what I'll be like when I'm 42. I thought, well, that's going to be quite old. I'm 20 plus years beyond that now. It's very hard to think what you'd be like when you're old. Can you imagine when you're going to be 60 or 70 or 80? I bet you can't. But you won't even think about that sort of thing. If you talk to old people, you'll find that often, I mean really old people, they'll say to you, I've heard it before from an old person saying to me, oh, don't grow old, because it's too painful. There are too many things that go wrong with you. It's not a good time of life. So here, Ecclesiastes is going to appeal to all of us, but particularly to those of you who are young, who don't understand what being old is like, though you can talk to people here, some of them, and you can find out. Okay? But what he's doing is he is writing to us here, and he's appealing to our imagination, and he's giving us mental pictures to imagine an old person. Okay? So chapter 12 here, and the first 5 verses are a picture of an old person. First of all, in verse 2, he speaks about things that give light. So the sun and the light and the moon and the stars, these are all things that actually give us light, as those things will grow dark. Those things will grow dark in our lives, perhaps because we can't see so well anymore. Okay? And the clouds return after the rain. Well, you've seen clouds, maybe this morning when you drove here. Was there rainstorms? Were there clouds? Was there rain? There was here in Exmouth, certainly. And the clouds came. But if you're an old person, you're like enjoying the sunshine. Sorry, a young person, you enjoy the sunshine. When you get older, it's like the clouds come over you. And they pour down rain. And you long for the clouds to go. When they move on, a whole set of new clouds take their place. The clouds return after the rain. You think they're going to pass, and they don't. They just keep coming back and back and back. The sweetness of life when you're young sours. Maybe there's a storm approaching. Maybe there's more storms than one. Maybe several storms. One after another. They come and they come and they come. And when you're old, it's like that. Just one rain cloud after another. Verses 3 and 4, I think, are a picture of a great house. Have you been to a country estate? Have you been to a great big country house? Maybe around here, Killerton, or one up the road from there, I forget there, near Tiverton. But there are these great country estates. And I think here, the writer is making us think about a big old house that is run down and decaying. Who's a member of the National Trust here? Who's a member of the National Trust? Quite a few of you. If you're ever in Derbyshire, go to Colke Abbey, C-A-L-K-E, Colke Abbey. The National Trust bought that about 40 years ago, and it was a great house in decline. And they've left it exactly as it was. And when you walk through it, you're seeing this great house, a house that was lived in by aristocracy. And it's all run down, and things are broken in the house, it's not working anymore. They wanted to leave it as an example of a house in decay. And that is what we're being shown here. Look at these verses, verse 3 and 4. When the keepers of the house, that's the domestic servants, they're old and they're trembling. And the strong men stoop, they're bowed down. So the servants walk around the house with their bent backs and their bent legs. It goes on to say, when the grinders cease. Now the grinders, those people who would be outside the house grinding the mill, that's what they did a lot of the time in agricultural periods. They would make bread. They'd go out and they'd harvest their grain, bring it in, and then they put it in the mill and they'd grind it, perhaps even with a hand mill. So it's saying that work is beginning to stop now. They're no longer able to go out to work regularly. And those looking through the windows, imagine this great house, people peering through the windows, and it grows dim. They can't see clearly anymore. The doors to the street are closed. They don't go out anymore because they're not able to. They're not mobile anymore. And the sound of grinding, they can't hear people at everyday work anymore. It's going quiet. They rise up at the sound of birds and all their songs grow faint. We're not quite sure what that means, but it may be talking about people who are waking up during the night and they're going to sleep again, think they're hearing the sound and they wake up. Fitful sleep, erratic sleep at night, which often is what the case is with older people. And all their songs grow faint. It could be also this picture of a great house refers to a picture of a house like a person's body. Okay, so look at verse 3. The keepers of the house could be a picture not only of the domestic servants, but of the hands. The keepers, those things that actually work for you, no longer working. The strong men could be the legs, and they're stooping now. The grinders could be the teeth. What's happened to them? They are few. Recognise that, some of us? Okay. Doors to the streets are closed. This person doesn't get out anymore into the streets. And the sound of everyday work again, their hearing is reduced. Their access to the world is getting smaller and smaller. There's a phrase which we sometimes use called ever-decreasing circles. And it talks about our lives. Towards the end of our lives, people live more and more in an ever-decreasing circle. They stop going out so much. And they become more based around their home. I remember when I was very young, I met my great-grandmother a few times. She lived in one room of my grandmother's house. And hardly ever went from that room. That's where she died. And her life, one time, she'd been out and about maybe, and now suddenly at the end of her life, she's confined to one single room. This is a picture, isn't it, of old age, a very powerful picture, I find. In verse 5, the imagery of a great house is suspended briefly. And we see here just a straightforward statement about men being afraid of heights. Maybe when you were young, maybe you climbed trees. And when you get older, you stop climbing trees because you're afraid that if you fall, you'll break your legs. When you're young, you don't care about that. You bounce, don't you, when you're young? When you hit the ground. But when you're old, you don't do those things anymore because you are fearful of heights. And also journeys as well. Young people like to travel around the world today. I know young people today who are talking about after university, they're going to go off and travel around the whole world. When we're old, we sort of think, I wouldn't do that now. I wouldn't do that now. There's so many difficulties, so many problems. So much stress and strain along the way. And so, yes, it's true, isn't it, that we are afraid of danger in the streets, going out. What's going to happen to us if we go out? The dangers that lie there. And then it says the almond tree. Well, the almond tree is a tree that blossoms in winter. And do you know what colour it is when it blossoms? It's white. White. Don't look around now, but there are people here whose hair is nearly white. That's what it's referring to. When the almond tree blossoms, when the hair becomes white. And the grasshopper drags himself along. The grasshopper, if you ever watch a grasshopper, normally they hop, sometimes they walk, and their big long legs lift them up and then drop them again. Lift them up and then drop them again. You see that picture of an old person walking with their stick maybe? The grasshopper drags himself along and desire no longer is stirred. It's referring to our appetites for food and for drink and for sex as well. Desire no longer is stirred. The appetite is no longer present as it was earlier. The great house, finally, is mourning. Man goes to his eternal home. End of verse 5. The great master of the house is dead, and mourners go about the streets as the windows of the house perhaps are boarded up. Remember him. And then he says, remember him before death sweeps you away. Verse 6 to 8. Remember him before the silver cord is severed. So verses 3 and 4 are talking about old age. Remember him before you grow old and life becomes difficult and painful. But remember him also before death sweeps you away. Verse 6. Remember him before the silver cord is severed or the golden bowl is broken. Before the pitcher is shattered at the spring or the wheel broken at the well. And the dust returns to the ground it came from, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. There are two pictures here, aren't there? One is of a bowl, a beautiful bowl, a golden bowl, and it's your life, it's my life. And he's saying that actually our lives are precious. They're precious to God as well. They're made of gold. And they're made to hold things, aren't they? In the Old Testament, what was the most common thing that a bowl held? It was oil. And oil, of course, is a symbol of the Holy Spirit. We were meant to be people who hold things. And most of all, hold God's life in us. But the silver cord is like the attachments we have to life itself. When it's severed, the golden ball breaks, it falls and it smashes. And it's no longer of any use. Once that fragile cord is smashed, the oil leaks out. And it's finished. It's no use for anything. Throw it away. Or the pitcher, it says. The pitcher is a jug that you would attach to a wheel, to a rope on a wheel, and the wheel is the winding mechanism, and you lower the pitcher down a well, and the well would draw out water. But when the wheel breaks, the pitcher falls and is smashed. There's a picture here, or a jug shattered at the spring, and the wheel broken at the well. Imagine that. Maybe think of a western we've seen, a wagon that's been destroyed. All you see are the wheels, broken wheels there, and dead people. That's what it's saying here, that this wheel that's broken means that the water can only be pulled up from the well. And again, the pitch that was meant to carry water, that is life-giving, can no longer do that. The day is finished when it was useful. It's a picture of death, isn't it? Two pictures of death, how precious our lives are. But how fragile they are, how easily smashed and broken they become. And after that, they're no use to anyone or anything. And then verse 7. The dust returns to the ground it came from, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. It's a reminder that in Genesis, when the curse came, God had made us from dust, but then it says, the curse, for dust you are, and to dust you will return. That's the awful picture here, isn't it? At the end of this verse in chapter 12, verse 7. So, let's think about this a bit more. I've said earlier that the whole book of Ecclesiastes, and next week Ian's going to be summing up in addition to what I'm saying now, but the whole book of Ecclesiastes is in a way a commentary on those verses in Genesis. It's on the curse. Life under the sun is life under the curse, in effect. It's life outside of Eden. Eden is paradise, God's paradise that He intended for us to live in. And you notice in verse 7, it actually reverses what happened in Genesis chapter 2. Because in Genesis chapter 2, God, it says, made man of the dust of the earth, and He breathed into him the breath of life. He made us out of dust, like that pot at the beginning. You saw that picture at the beginning, made that clay pot, and then He breathed into us the breath of life. Breath of life, the Spirit, if you like, the Spirit returns to God here. It says, the Spirit, the breath of life is, if you like, the gift of intelligent life. Our brains think. Your brain's thinking this, I hope they're thinking this morning. I trust they all are. It's that principle of responsible life. We're not just ordinary creatures, cats and dogs and cows and horses. We have a spirit in us which God has given us. And we've heard earlier that spirit, when we're born, is something that can actually think about God. No animal thinks about God. We alone do that, don't we? In the whole of the animal kingdom. But here it's reversed. Interesting also, isn't it, that the things that Ecclesiastes has said we should enjoy in life, food, drink, work, marriage. Here, chapter 11 and verse 7, remember it's light. Light is sweet. All those things have one thing in common. Do you know what they are? They are all created before the fall, aren't they? They're all things that we can enjoy because they're things that God made that were good and meant for our enjoyment. Listen to them again and think about where they occur in Genesis chapter 2. Food. On the trees, it was good food. On the fruit of the trees, it's good, isn't it, for food? Drink also. Work. God put Adam in the garden to work the garden, didn't He? Marriage, He created man and woman, didn't He? And brought the woman to the man. Marriage was a good thing before creation. Light, let there be light, and there was light. They're all things that were before the fall. All those 5 things. They all occur in Ecclesiastes. They're all things we're meant to enjoy. And rightly so. And in Genesis 2, verse 17, God warned Adam, don't eat from the fruits. Don't eat the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. When you eat of that, you will surely die. You will surely die. Satan said to them, oh, you won't surely die. And of course, when they ate the fruits, they didn't die, did they, immediately? They kept on living. There was no thunderbolt from heaven saying, right, you're dead for doing that. But the principle of death, of decay, entered. That principle of vanity, of frustration, of decay. And that is what Ecclesiastes is referring to here in his book, isn't it? That principle of decay. We are actually, as the Book of Common Prayer says in the Anglican Church, in the midst of life, we are in death. Do you know, from the moment you were born, even those of you who are young, the moment you were born, you began to die. Cells in your body reproduced and then began to die off. And when you're young, they're replaced by more cells, but there's still cells that are dying there, even now. When you get old, there's going to be more and more cells that are dying and fewer that are being reproduced. But we're all dying. Even now, every one of us in this room now, the principle of death has entered. And that came because of the fall. And so here, what we're being shown by Ecclesiastes is that slow process of going towards the grave. And at the end, there is death. Yes, Satan said, you won't surely die. And they didn't immediately, but they began to die. And then at the end, yes, the silver cord is severed. The golden bowl is broken. And the pitcher is shattered at the spring. And reach the end of that process. So he says, verse 6, remember him. Remember him before that happens. Hold him close to you. But here's a thought. It's been very depressing up to now, hasn't it? Do you agree? Why, though, does the writer say, remember your Creator? Because if death is the end, and if it is meaningless, why say, remember your Creator? Why tell us to do that if in fact there's no point to it? There must be a point, mustn't there, to remembering your Creator. So in some way, Ecclesiastes is saying, yes, it is pretty despairing, isn't it? But he holds out hope that the Creator has an answer. Remember him, hold him close to you, because somewhere the Creator will do something to change this awful curse that is on us. And of course, in the New Testament, we have that answer, don't we? Because we're told when Jesus Christ comes, he reveals to us what? He destroys death and he brings to light immortality and life through the gospel. So we live in times when we can actually understand through the New Testament that the Creator has done something to answer the awful despair of Ecclesiastes. So, what should we do this morning about this? There's the words we see in the Corinthians, isn't it? Yes, death has been swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? Is what we sang earlier in that song, Abide With Me. And that is what the Creator says, that I have overcome death. I have destroyed it. There is no more sting in death. Sting hurts, doesn't it? You're being stung by a bee or a wasp, it hurts. But the sting of death has been taken away, he says, by Jesus Christ on the cross. So what should we do about it this morning? Well, if I say to you, remember, well, of course you say, that's what you've been saying the whole morning. Remember. But remember in this sense that God comes first in your affections. When I say remember your Creator, what comes into your mind? Is it the person that above all you love more than anyone else in this world? Is it the person you hold most dear, that you speak to more than anyone else? Because the Bible says that you need to hold God first in your affections. When Jesus was asked, what is the greatest commandment? He said this, hear, O Israel, you heard it before, didn't you, in Deuteronomy, the Lord your God is one, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, all your soul, and all your strength. Put your hand up if you do that. I don't. So actually it's not possible to remember our Creator as we're told to. As Ecclesiastes says, we need to remember him. But how can we remember him in this way if Jesus says he requires to be first in our hearts? All our heart, all our soul, all our mind, all our strength. I can't do that. I don't know about you, but I don't think any of us can. But what we can remember, of course, is this. It's the man who has done it, who did love God, the Father, with all his heart and soul and mind and strength, and who did that for me and for you. So we don't have to be perfect, because Jesus Christ was perfect for us. And if we remember him and his death on the cross, God says that will count for you, so that we can be saved through Jesus Christ. He paid the penalty for our sin. And he puts a new spirit in us as well. The old spirit is going. The spirit that God breathed into man in Genesis. But God says the Holy Spirit will come into your life and will give you new life that will last forever and ever. Do you believe that with all your heart? Trust him. Remember him in that way. The God who has redeemed us and has given us a chance of new life that will last forever. Just a last word, not those of you who are young, but those of you who are older. and I'm wondering, is it too late for me? Has this passed me by? I'm no longer young. Does that mean I can't take hold of this? If you've got that bulletin still, on the inside, that insert on the back of it, it's a testimony of a man who was 77 years old, Roger Stanley. Do take it away and read it. It's about his testimony, about how at that age, finally he heard the call to faith and became a believer. He didn't go to church, he believed in God, but he hadn't held God in his heart. He hadn't remembered him with affection. And he became aware of that. Do read that, and maybe an encouragement to you if you're wondering whether it is too late. No, it's not too late. You're here this morning. Thank God. There are people in the Bible like Nicodemus who heard when he was quite late on in life, and though we can't be sure what happened to Nicodemus, it does seem as if at the end of his life he was the one who helped bring Christ's body down from the cross and helped bury him. There are people here who have come to faith in the last few years as well. When they were past their 60th birthday, talk to them as well. It is possible. It's never too late. Many things have happened, and maybe you've become over time bitter and angry about things, and you have broken relationships in your lives. And yes, there are those things that are hindrances to coming to faith, but they're not hindrances that need prevent God from reaching us. So if you're an older person this morning and you're wondering about that, you can become a child of God this morning. Faith is possible for you as well. Just confess those sins and ask God to make you a child, to put His Spirit in you, to forgive you your sins, and to do what He did for Adam in Genesis, to breathe new life into you. And though you may be old, yet you can again become a child. Let us bow our heads in prayer.